A 14-year-old boy with something more dangerous than a gun, a spray can in hand, mind racing with defiance, or perhaps he might just be tired of living under the rulership of a dictator, or it's possible that he was merely acting on a childhood impulse. As he scrolled the words, "Next, it's your turn, doctor." A direct challenge to the president himself. What seemed like an innocently foolish act was nothing, but this was the story of Muawiyah Zassani, and what he did was the trumpet of war against the stern ruler of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. This is where it all begins, a regime or country, and a young boy caught in the whirlwind of a geopolitical struggle that will change Syria forever. At the center of it all stands Bashar al-Assad, a leader branded by some as a ruthless dictator, yet to others he is a steadfast defender against the chaos and radicalism. In this video, we'll uncover the truth behind the shocking rise of the extremist groups like Hayat Tahrir-ul-Sham, the group which is controlling Syria's reins at the moment, whose roots themselves lie in the jihadist ideologies, and how their rise fueled the rebellion against Assad's regime. We'll explore the pivotal moment when a teenager's graffiti became the spark for a revolution that spiraled out of control, with Syria caught between the Western-backed rebels, Iranian militias, Russians, airstrikes, and the growing threat of groups like ISIL. Was Assad really the villain, or was he simply the last line of defense against the rising tide of extremism? Get ready for a journey through one of the most complex conflicts of our time. From the fall of cities to the rise of radical forces, we'll reveal how Syria became the chessboard for global powers. Bashar al-Assad's story begins long before the civil war. It starts with his father, Hafiz al-Assad, one of the most formidable and controversial leaders in the history of the Middle East. Hafiz seized power in Syria through a military coup in 1970, overthrowing the existing government and establishing an authoritarian regime that would last for 3 decades. His rule was characterized by strong military control, strict political repression, and a complex balancing act between religious sects and regional powers. Under Hafiz, Syria became a key player in regional politics, aligning itself with Soviet interests during the Cold War, and later with Iran after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. He maintained a strong hold over the country by centralizing power within his family, while simultaneously playing off the influence of global superpowers to retain control. His policies of control, surveillance, and use of force kept the country under tight rule, but left it politically stagnant. At the time of Hafiz al-Assad's death in 2000, Bashar, his youngest son, was an unlikely candidate of succession. Initially, the crown was supposed to fall on his elder brother, Bashar al-Assad, a charismatic military officer seen as more prepared to take the reins. He was the golden boy of the family. However, Bashir's tragic death in a car accident in 1994 left Bashar in a quiet position he never anticipated. At the time, Bashar was living in London working as an ophthalmologist, a quiet yet intellectual figure with no military or political training. He was far removed from the world of governance and power. Yet, his father's sudden passing thrust him into a leadership role, and in a matter of months, Bashar al-Assad was declared the new president of Syria. Bashar al-Assad's ascension to the presidency was a dramatic shift for Syria. With no experience in politics or war, he appeared to first to be the puppet of the old regime. However, he quickly adopted to his father's strategy of absolute control. Bashar initially made efforts to present himself as a reformer, suggesting a move toward the political liberalization and economic reforms, which gained him some initial support both domestically and abroad. However, he quickly learned that any true reforms were bound to clash with the entrenched interests of Syria's political elite. and the military, who had been loyal to his father for decades. Bashar al-Assad's rule followed many of the same authoritarian principles his father had laid down. He too centralized power around his family, ensuring that his relatives controlled key sectors of the economy and security apparatus. He also established a tight grip on the media, stifling opposition and limiting their dissent. Bashar inherited the strategy of balancing different factions within Syria, playing on the interests of the Alawite minority which his father's families belonged to, the Sunni majority, and other religious and ethnic groups. He continued his father's policy of cultivating strong alliances with Iran, Russia, and various other military groups in the region to solidify his power and protect Syria's interests. Or we can argue his own interests. Syria's position in the Middle East was sandwiched between Israel, Iraq, Lebanon, and its alliances with Iran. But don't forget Russia. All of this made it a key piece in the geopolitical puzzle. As Bashar al-Assad took power, the country found itself under heavy influence from the several global powers, with each having their own personal interests and agendas. The Russian Federation saw Syria as a crucial ally in the Middle East, and they maintained a strong military and diplomatic presence. Bashar's regime became one of Russia's few remaining allies in the region after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia's support was vital during the Syrian civil war. They provided military aid and strategic backing, especially in the form of airstrikes and military advisors. Russia's involvement was particularly motivated by a desire to maintain its Mediterranean naval base in Tartut, ensuring its military presence in the region. Bashar's regime had close ties with Iran, a key Shiite power. Iran's support was crucial in helping Assad maintain control over Syria during the uprising. Iran sent troops, advisors, and militias to aid Assad's forces in return for Syrian cooperation in maintaining the Shiite crescent, an alliance of sort of Shia majority countries spanning from Iran through Iraq and Syria to Lebanon, where Hezbollah operated. For Iran, Assad's regime was central to its geopolitical strategy of challenging US influence in the region and supporting its allies, especially Hezbollah. Bashar al-Assad's relationship with the West was initially more open, especially during the early years of his presidency. Western leaders hoped for reform or for diplomatic engagement in the hope that Syria might open up its economy and political system. However, this engagement soured over time, especially as Syria's relationship with Iran and Hezbollah deepened. The US began viewing Assad with increasing suspicion. Despite being perceived as a ruthless dictator, many argue that Bashar al-Assad has been more of a puppet than a mastermind. His survival as a leader was never purely a result of his own strength, but rather a delicate balancing act of navigating the interests of these major powers. Syria's strategic importance as a buffer between Israel and its Arab neighbors, as a regional player in the fight against terrorism, and as an ally to both Iran and Russia, meant that global powers could not afford to ignore it. Throughout his reign, Assad adapted to these pressures, maintaining a tight relationship with his patrons while starving of internal rebellions and regional threats. During the year 2011, a wave of protests and uprisings swept across the Arab world. Inspired by the success of Tunisia and Egyptian revolution against their dictators, ordinary citizens across the Middle East began demanding an end to authoritarian regimes, political reforms, and better economic conditions. This wave of a revolution against the dictator was termed as Arab Spring. The seeds of the Syrian civil war were sown during this spring 2011. At the time, Syria, under the rule of al-Assad, had been a nation in apostasy. Although Bashar had initially promised reform after taking power in 2000, many of these reforms remained superficial. Syria's economy was struggling, employment rates were high, and there was widespread frustration with the political corruption and the lack of civil liberties. Assad had tried to project an image of modernization, but political repression, censorships, and the lack of fundamental freedoms painted a different pictures for the average Syrian. The first true sign of unrest came not from organized political groups, but from a group of teenagers in the southern city of dhruv. In March 2011, Muawiyah, a 14-year-old boy, watching the news of Arab Spring, the revolution that was taking the all Middle East by surprise, somehow got motivated along with his friends. They gathered and pre-printed a simple yet defiant message on a school wall. Next, it's your turn, doctor. A direct challenge to President Bashar al-Assad, who had trained as an ophthalmologist before assuming the presidency. These seemingly innocent acts of graffiti turned out to be the spark that ignited Syria's catastrophic civil war. The phrase was a clear reference to Assad's perceived weakness as a ruler and a mockery of his medical background. The graffiti was seen as an act of rebellion, but what followed was far more severe. Daraa was under control of Najib, a cousin of Syrian President Bashar. Najib served as the head of the political security directorate in Daraa. On Assad's order, he arrested those teenagers and tortured them for several days. People of Daraa continuously demanded the release of those teenagers. The fire of these protests spread across several cities of the nation. After several weeks of torture, Bashar was eventually forced to release them due to the developing public pressure. After releasing the kids, their condition sparked outrage among the families and the wider community. This brutal treatment of minors became a flash triggering protests that initially began as a demand for the release of the detained children. The localized protests in Daraa escalated quickly and had spread to the different regions in Syria, reaching cities like Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo. The protesters, many of whom were young, were demanding political reforms, the release of political prisoners, and an end to the security state that had controlled Syria for decades. The momentum grew, and soon calls for regime change began to emerge. However, Bashar's government responded harshly. The peaceful protests were met overwhelming force. The government deployed security forces, militias, and army units to crush growing dissent. Peaceful protests were met with brutal crackdowns, including the use of live ammunition, mass arrests, torture, and even the targeting of medical facilities that were treating the wounded protesters. One of such horrific incidents took place in Al-Umri Mosque. As protesters continuously being injured by Bashar's militia, they were brought to hospitals for the treatment of wounds. But instead, the hospitals were raided and the injured protesters were arrested even without treatment. So, to counter this, people turned several mosques into first aid centers. One such mosque was Al-Umri Mosque in Daraa. It became a focal point during the early days of Syrian's uprising. It began to serve as a hospital for the wounded protesters. On April 30, 2011, the Syrian army, using tanks and helicopters, stormed the mosque, killing several individuals in the process, including the imam's son. What initially appeared to be a popular uprising against the authoritarian rule quickly evolved into a more complex and multi-dimensional conflict. While many of the older protesters were motivated by a desire for democratic change, the Assad regime crackdown pushed many of them into the arms of various rebels. These rebel groups, some of them secular, other Islamists, began to organize more formally as a government military response grew more brutal. The conflict soon took on a sectarian dimension. The Assad regime was dominated by Alawite sect, a minority group in Syria that adheres to an offshoot of Shia Islam, while the majority of Syrians were Sunni Muslims. This division created a sectarian undercurrent to the conflict, as the regime's brutal action alienated many Sunnis, leading to fears that the Alawite community might face retribution if the Assad regime fell.
Central Homs and the Alawite strongholds of Latakia and Tartus were filled with major demonstrations on Wednesday, after an undated video circulated on social media that appeared to show an attack on an Alawite shrine.
The Syrian's military and its security services remained loyal to Bashar, largely due to its regime's patronage system, where key military positions as well as significant portions of the economy were itself controlled by Assad's loyalists, many of whom were Alawite and his own cousin. As violence escalated, many of the soldiers began defecting from the regime. One of most vital to the cause was Rathee al-Assad. He was one of the loyalists and was playing a pivotal role in the army. He founded Free Syrian Army, or FSA, on 29 July 2011 with the help of 6 officers who also